to show you a couple of results from case studies that we conducted. And then we are going towards the idea or the concept of surveillance and think about what this whole thing could mean in terms of One Health surveillance. So I'll do a short introduction on socio-ecological systems and wicked problems, and then we'll look at One Health surveillance. And finally, I hope that we have a bit of a discussion on some of maybe provocative suggestions that I bring forward and your thoughts on it that are in the ground, responsible for governance, and actually might think critically about these things as well. So, the Network for Evaluation of One Health, as I said, was funded by the EU Cost Initiative. It's funding networks, networking meetings, training schools, short scientific missions, which means that individual scientists that are moving to another place for a couple of weeks, and then dissemination activities such as my visit here and to the Saskatoon One Health conference. So the aim of the network was to develop a framework to evaluate One Health, so the theoretical background, develop a One Health index and evaluation protocols, then to apply all this to case studies, to do a meta-analysis, and finally disseminate the results to governments, NGOs, academia, industry, and whoever else might be interested in the matter. We are writing a handbook or printing right now, so the handbook will contain a current evaluation of approaches to health, an analysis of the alignment of the One Health approach with the Sustainable Development Goals that were formulated in 2015 by the UN. Then it will contain the evaluation framework. It will show some One Health methods and metrics, so particularly the One Health Index, but also summarize approaches to social sustainability and evaluation thereof, ecological evaluation, and economic evaluation. And finally, there will be a chapter on the governance of One Health, outlining how all this can be aligned with the current understanding of governance. So the handbook is going to be printed and open access available on the 10th of September of this year. And we're going to have a conference in Bologna for this event. So this is going to be the final conference of our network. And after that, we still don't know how the network is going to continue. But we hope that we can maintain at least a community of practice. So, our analysis of what One Health is. It's basically a learning organization that has a number of particularities or characteristics that make up the functioning of that initiative, and has some specific drivers and outcomes, which I'll explain in a minute. So when we look at how a One Health initiative is composed, we have a set of characteristics that belong to some dynamics or operational principles, and then we have a set that would be the supporting infrastructures. So the operational aspects will be One Health thinking. So the important thing is that we think in different dimensions. We basically apply systems thinking, so we look at events, patterns, and structures that are underlying these patterns or producing these patterns. We think across scales, so from individual to populations up to communities, ecosystems. We think in the causal chain, so we try to localize our initiative within the chain of events, be that now an outbreak or be that some other chronic disease and its causes. Then the planning is primarily concerned about matching the tasks, the resources and the competencies, so that there's no mismatch, because that's something that is quite common, that you might have the resources somewhere and the task somewhere else, and that needs within One Health operation, particularly because we have different sectors involved, it's really important that that is well addressed. Then we need to foresee appropriate methods to engage the essential actors and stakeholders. We need to have a structure or plan the structure, location and timing of the initiative compared to the outcomes, because at the wrong timing you might interfere with other things that are essential in the system's operation. And then plan mechanisms to self-assess, learn and reflect and adapt on the new knowledge that is coming up through the implementation of this initiative. Finally, in the operations, we have the One Health working, which is basically transdisciplinarity. So that's there's different interpretations of the term transdisciplinarity. Ours is that it is interdisciplinarity, so across disciplines, including participation of people concerned. So that goes all the way down to those people that are concerned by the disease or the condition that you're trying to address. And it doesn't stop at the governance level and just include the governing institutions. Then we need to see that the different disciplines and sectors are involved or integrated, that the stakeholders participate, that there's reflection and learning that goes across those meeting or intersections, and then that there's efficiency and effectiveness in problem solving, so we don't just talk about our mutual problems, but we actually solve them. Then there's an aspect of systemic organization, which is now shifting towards the supporting infrastructure. So this management needs to have social and leadership skills. It needs to be shared, so it needs to be shared across different centers, and it needs to be adaptive to the changing conditions in the system, because a system usually is not static, but it actually changes over time. Then we're looking at team structures. So are there teams? How are they structured? How big are they? And are they actually operational and functional? And finally, we look at the individual actors. We look at how those actors are composed. So how are the competencies and how is their knowledge actually acknowledged within the whole system? Then obviously there's a question of high connectivity, of synchronization of activities across the whole initiative that are really important as a backbone. Then we move over to learning. So we need to share knowledge, so we need to gather it, we need to store it, and we need to distribute it. We need to have a working environment, technology, and a reward system, as well as a policy that actually allows learning at different scales. So we're looking at the individual scale, but we also look at team-level learning, and we look at organizational learning, which includes that we need an institutional memory. So how is memory warranted, even if there's fluctuation with the personnel? Finally, we're looking at feedback mechanisms, so it must be possible for individuals to bring up critique or feedback about the application of the system and the idea or the concept of the system, which then feeds back into the operation of the whole initiative, and therefore allows also the learning or the self-regulation as an institution or as a system by itself. Finally, we have a sharing infrastructure that is knowledge, data, resources, and staff. There should be internal as well as external sharing mechanisms, so sharing towards society, but also sharing within the most involved actors. There need to be resources put aside for the sharing infrastructure, so this is one of the critical questions. Then it's the question about the quality of the data, storage, and accessibility of data. So here we look primarily at hurdles towards accessing data. So are there agreements? Is it based on personal connections, etc., etc.? And particularly, one of our most important aspects is that sharing resilient to change. So again, if we have some gatekeepers of the sharing mechanisms, if those gatekeepers leave the initiative, our sharing basically collapses. So it's important that there is a concept how this sharing can continue despite people leaving. So basically, this approach then has the promises of health and well-being. We are expecting interspecies equity, a term that we actually coined within our network, because we think about equity across species borders and not just equity within different cultures and different ethnicities or nationalities. And we think about stewardship, so that we individuals take responsibility of what is being done. We expect effectiveness and efficiency, and these are all three part of, again, the social, the ecological, and the economic pillars of sustainability. So at the end of the day, we realized throughout the work in this network that actually we're all implicitly expecting sustainability through applying a One Health approach. And that was a very important realization also, because it was right in the time when the Sustainable Development Goals came up, and we realized that actually our expectations from One Health were basically perfectly in line with the ambitions that the Sustainable Development Goals are bringing forward. And therefore, these mentioned on the left side here, the social, economic, and environmental pillar of sustainability are really one of the core elements that we're trying to address also throughout the handbook, and we're providing metrics to measure the social resilience, the economic effectiveness and efficiency, as well as the environmental sustainability. So now I'm moving forward towards the framework. So the beginning of our framework actually demands that we define the system. So we first need to identify what are we actually looking at. And we're not only looking at the system as in the initiative that we're talking about, but we're actually looking at the system within which we try to implement. So this can be a food production chain, it can be a health system, it can be a regional, a national health system, etc., etc. The granularity of our appreciation is also going to be defined primarily through the stakeholders that are participating in the initiative, because they're going to define the granularity. All stakeholders, ideally all stakeholders, are involved in this process, so that we get a multitude of perspectives, trying to get a holistic or comprehensive appreciation as possible. And then in a second step, we describe the initiative itself within that bigger system. And from there we move over to defining a theory of change. So we expect that our initiative is going to move the greater system into a certain direction and bring specific outcomes, and depending on those outcomes we will move towards designing an impact evaluation, an economic evaluation, or actually a nonlinear impact evaluation if we're trying to capture the more subtle, unexpected outcomes that might arise. Then we're going to select metrics for different outcomes, and those, again, we classify them according to disciplinary, interdisciplinary, and systemic outcomes, because they are really classes of themselves. Conventionally, we would probably tend towards disciplinary outcomes, because that's what we're used to from our personal experience. And the challenge is then really to move towards interdisciplinary outcomes and actually appreciate systemic outcomes that these initiatives can also produce. And this is really where we're expecting the added value of One Health. So the motivation, one of the main drivers of motivation for this network was really that we lack information on the added value that One Health may bring. But that was also primarily because we were focusing on disciplinary outcomes, and we actually didn't address what at systems level was really changing. So this is why we insist on addressing systemic outcomes as an outcome of a One Health approach. So then another thing is that if we're talking about complex systems, we always have unexpected outcomes. They can be positive, but they can also be negative. Historically, probably the negative outcomes are more known and are more prevalent, but we have to insist that there are also positive unexpected outcomes. And those can be the creation of a new professional network, they can be new awareness, all sorts of things that we might not target within the theory of change of our initiative at the beginning. So it is important that if we address something in a One Health approach that we capture unexpected outcomes no matter what we do and what our theory of change is. So then on the other side, we're trying to assess these characteristics that I mentioned in the beginning. So we assess the so-called One Healthness. So how is knowledge integrated, the parts of thinking, sharing, working, and the infrastructure that underlines this. And from there, obviously, parts of it can also be outcomes. So it can be the target that we have a learning, or that we set up a learning organization. So this could be an outcome of our initiative, but at the same time, we think and consider it as part of One Health. So of the One Healthness of an initiative, or the degree of integration, if you want. And to assess that in a more, let's say, summarizing way, we thought about a One Health index, and I'm going to illustrate that in a minute. So finally, in order to assess and provide evidence for added value of a One Health approach, we are going to compare, on the one side, this integration of knowledge, and on the other side, the impact, economic validity or value, or the unexpected outcomes that are produced by this initiative, and thereby showing how this initiative can actually contribute. So the One Health Index is basically a hexagon or a spider diagram of those 6 dimensions that we talked about. So the 6 aspects have each got an axis, and they can be rated between 0 and 1. And you will notice that on the left-hand side you have working, thinking, and planning, which is the dynamic part, so the operational part. On the right side you have learning, sharing, and systemic organization, which is going to be the infrastructure. So thereby we hope to actually identify a ratio between the operations and the infrastructure, because our postulation behind this, or hypothesis behind this, is that you may think very comprehensively and idealistically, but if you don't follow up with an infrastructure that is going to support this idea, you're not going to achieve anything. On the other hand, you might have initiatives that actually don't think very far in terms of integration, but that actually provide a perfect infrastructure that would support something that is then integrated. So, therefore, if you look at there's 2 projects as examples here. You will have the project 1, which tends towards the left upper right, the left upper half, and this one would be a project that thinks primarily in theory about an integrated approach, and has a lot of things in place that make it that should work, but on the other hand, it doesn't match this with a sharing and learning infrastructure, and therefore will probably not sustain. On the other side, we have the project 2 here in light blue, which would have a massive sharing infrastructure, but actually doesn't really think about the integration of this knowledge in a broader context. So we thought that this was quite a useful approach to get an appreciation of this particular assessment or evaluation, and I'm going to show you a couple of case studies in which we applied it and we got first experiences. So those case studies, you can find them under the link that is below there. It's a research topic in Frontiers. Multiple Frontiers journals have participated, so it's Frontiers in Microbiology, Public Health, Veterinary Science, Social Science, Education. So there's multiple participants, and we published 8 case studies in there, alongside with the framework, or a part of that framework. So the first pair I would like to present is brucellosis control in Malta and Serbia. So on the left-hand side you have the evaluation results of the Maltese approach to control of brucellosis, and noteworthy is that Malta is an island. So it's an island, and as you know, Brucella melitensis gets his name from Malta, so it has actually a century of measures and setbacks trying to control brucellosis. So the actual control was achieved after an interdisciplinary approach was implemented in the 1990s, and it relied heavily on legislation. But you can see that there's a strong balance, or a good balance, between the operations and the infrastructure that underlines this, and it's relatively well developed on all axes. In contrast, in Serbia, the problem is relatively recent, and it started in the 1990s after uncontrolled importation of animals after the former Yugoslavian war. So there was no cultural resistance to cull potentially infected herds, which actually didn't make it that much important to involve people. And therefore you can see that in the working, it also did not emphasize as much, and the whole thinking process was not really initiated based on the idea that they didn't have success. Nevertheless, it worked because it was a relatively young disease in the area. So the lessons we learned from this is basically that One Health is needed at the right time, at the right place. So context really matters. One Health in this context should really reinforce existing unidisciplinary efforts, which is shown by the Maltese example. And in Malta, the non-scientific community was a key, whereas in Serbia it wasn't, because human cases were rare in Malta. So that makes the difference between these two cases, and I think there's really something we can learn from it. So the next set of examples is cysticercosis in Portugal, which is a project that is implementing an observatory for cysticercosis. It is conceived as a interdisciplinary, intersectoral project. However, if you look at the bottom right of the spider diagram, you can see that there's very little effort made to ensure learning, sharing, and also the organization is relatively unidisciplinary. So the concept is primarily there, but the whole implementation and the way that it's actually put in practice is not very well, not fully fledged yet. In contrast, so there's noteworthy that cysticercosis is a relatively young disease again in Portugal, so it has emerged recently and is not really something that's been there for a long time. In contrast, West Nile virus in the middle in Italy is an endemic disease. So it's been there and people are living with it. So the government agencies are well aware of it, and this project was a surveillance and early warning system for West Nile virus in Italy. So there were three regions involved in this. So the whole thing is actually fully fledged, with maybe a bit of a deficit in the learning organization, because that's something that we're just not used to think of, because there's a tendency of thinking of government agencies not as learning organizations, but actually as static bodies. So that was one thing that came out of the evaluation, was that for the involved people, it was very interesting to actually consider themselves as a learning organization, and then see how they could improve to become a learning organization and to sustain this learning process as an organization. So then the Southern African Infectious Disease Surveillance System is then an international ambitious program to collaborate on the surveillance of infectious disease and emerging infectious diseases. So here they're trying to train champions for the future. So One Health champions for the future. And what is interesting that you can see is that the sharing infrastructure is basically inexistent, which has to do with the national boundaries, because there is still quite a sensitivity towards sharing information across boundaries. So the lessons we can learn from this is that all projects will start with good ideas, but they need to materialize over time. International collaborations will be more challenging because they address a bigger system, and they will also require more time. So at the end of the day, size matters. bottom-up governance may be more challenging in international approaches than it will be in national approaches, because there's a lot of additional barriers to sharing and to learning mutually. So then we come to a couple of other settings. One is a university program in Copenhagen, and the other one is a problem with acaricides in Zambia. So the university in Copenhagen was about antimicrobial control. It was a purely academic program which did not involve any stakeholders, basically, other than academics. And the realization was that the research environment doesn't really encourage interdisciplinarity. The project was 4 years, and it actually addressed a huge socio-ecological system. So the results and the outcomes were actually difficult to assess, because you had a 4-year program and a system that might react over 20 years. So again, size matters. And on the right-hand side in Zambia, we were looking at a project that was implemented after they had implemented some acaricidic treatments of cattle in Zambia. And they realized that people were using the containers to store milk and food and all sorts of other things, and they were fearing the toxic consequences of it. So as a result, the Italians went there and tried to sensitize people for the dangers that this whole issue could bring. And obviously, it was already a secondary approach. So the first approach had already been done, had not really included the cultural aspect of this acaricidic treatment. And here, obviously, the sensitization was already done, so people were already aware of the issue. And you can see that because it's nicely balanced across the two sides. So it was considering the dynamics as well as the infrastructural hurdles that you would have when trying to be comprehensive about it. So the lessons that we can learn here is that the context really is essential and will determine whether you have a success or a no success in an integrated and interdisciplinary approach. So our conclusions were that the One Health ratio illustrates the match between intentions and infrastructure. The framework was found useful for feedback to the project participants, so it was a kind of a formative evaluation. And the scoring relied on individual perceptions, obviously, of the evaluators. So the question is whether we can generalize these results, and we need to bear that in mind. So what we're trying to do now is to apply this to scientific manuscripts in One Health, which raised the question about the information that needs to be published if we're publishing some work about One Health. Because a lot of the information, such as the management structure, the sharing and the learning infrastructure, they're never published because you're only publishing the outcomes and maybe the way with whom you're working. So we're thinking about setting up a standard on project reporting along the lines of the Equator framework. So now the question is, what does this imply for One Health surveillance? So I take a step back and think about what a system is. So a system is a group of interacting, interrelated or interdependent or independent components that form a complex unified whole. Components can be intangible, such as relationships, policies, laws, values, etc. We can think of systems as nodes embedded in a giant network. And the defining characteristics of these systems are that they serve a specific purpose within a larger system, and all parts must be present for the system to function. So the parts must be arranged in a specific way so that it functions well. So you can't just shift them around or just shuffle. And the system maintains stability through fluctuations and adjustments. So those systems have internal and external feedback, which is really important. So if we think about life as a hierarchy, we can think of cells Those cells are cell communities, then they build a tissue or a microbiome, they build an organ system, an individual, a population, a community, an ecosystem, a landscape, or an ecoregion. So you can see that those systems within the system, there's really a nested organization. On the other hand, we actually have overlapping systems. So we have the physical world with the ecosystem, but within there we have communities of marsh forest, subalpine, alpine grassland. Then we have populations that share different of those communities. And again, they overlap with a fox and a hare population, a human population, and bacterial microbiota that are, again, crossing those borders. So we can't really draw the line. So that means, why is this important? Because that means that there's multiple paths and interacting components. Cause and effect relationships are not apparent. So from your personal perspective, there's really no one under control. Some type of selection process is at work where components and results of their interactions are being selected or deleted. There's a variation and novelty which is being added over time into the system, and the system will generate its own behavior. So behavior is complex. It's not just an input-output singular response. Behavior is a complex, it goes in multiple directions. So they're feedback loops, and they're unpredictable and intractable, which is important to bear in mind because we tend to think about our interventions as something that is determined, and we tend to model it with deterministic models. So particularly when we think about epidemiology, I'm not saying that deterministic models are useless, but we need to bear in mind that the system within which they operate may not be as simple and as linear as we tend to model things. So how is this going to affect the surveillance? Diseases occur in socio-ecological systems, so those are adaptive, complex adaptive systems. And in those systems we tend to face wicked problems. So what are wicked problems? They're problems that usually are not understood. So take the example of obesity. We don't really understand how obesity comes about and how we can address it. But we will probably know it by the time we've addressed it. So it's a kind of a circular definition of the problem. Wicked problems are usually not, in time, they're not finished. So they tend, once you have addressed it, it tends to maintain itself, but the problems tends to shift. So it's it's basically a never-ending story. The solutions are not really right or wrong. So you can't really say this is a wrong way of addressing the problem, but you can't also say this is the right way of addressing the problem. Usually they create new problems, and every solution or every problem, and according to that also every solution, is actually novel and unique. So it's a one-shot operation. And usually you have no alternatives. So you can't really try again. So examples are that health problems vary over time in geographical regions, social strata, and affected species, which means that really no health problem is the same, because you always have different contexts in which they occur.
Sorry, I'm just going to ask the participants or the people listening on the webinar to please mute your microphones. We're having some background noise. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So as a result, the response to those problems can be projects, programs, or policies. Those have very different timescales. So again, we have the matter of context, of quality of the system, but also the matter of time that really play an important role. So I'd like to play this video, and I hope that the sound is going to come along. No?
Again, please, if you're on the line, can you check that you're muted? Because we are getting some noise and chatter here.
Okay.
I believe that's through *6. I don't know, Jean, if you can help me to mute people remotely, or...
So apparently that doesn't work. It's a shame. But for those of you who are interested, try to look at Alan Atkinson's TED Talk at Uppsala in 2014. And he talks about a WHO action to address malaria. Can't remember. I think it was in Borneo. And at the time, it was in the 1950s. The goal, well, the solution seemed very simple, and it was DDT. So they sprayed DDT, and as a result, they killed all insects, among which was a wasp, which was muted on another type of bug, and those bugs, they were eating thatch. So as a result of the DDT treatment, the thatch roofs of those huts were being eaten, and therefore they needed to address the housing problem. So they used tin roof, and the tin roofs actually had a climatic impact, so there was an epidemic of cholera. And that was part of it, and the other thing was, I think, were rats that were starting to live in these houses. And then ultimately the WHO planned to parachute cats into the forest to get control of the rats. So it's a very humoristic way of explaining how a complex system actually really needs a lot of thought before you get in there. So I really recommend having a look at it. And so here we go. So what is surveillance in this context? Surveillance is an activity aimed at producing information to take decisions about health. I think it's important that we need to focus on health. Because when we look at the options for disease control, again, from a systemic perspective, we can look at events, we can look at patterns, and we can look at the structure, the underlying structure. So this is reflected here with our options to control. We can treat as a reaction to an event. We can slaughter or we can stamp out as a reaction to an event. On the left-hand side for humans, on the right-hand side for animals. But on midterm, we can vaccinate as a reaction to patterns, because we realize that it's going to happen over and over again, so we vaccinate. We can educate because we realize that we can change the way these patterns occur. But if we want to change it on the long term, we need to understand what structures are actually producing these patterns. And those structures are a matter of changing the environment, are changing values and behavior, and are changing governance of the system. So again, if we address things in a systemic way, we need to be aware at which time level we're trying to address it. And if we want to take these kind of decisions, we also need to think about surveillance on which information does it need to provide us to take decisions at which level of time. And that is really the question that we need to ask, or the questions that we need to answer. What is the goal of the One Health project? What decisions do we need to make to achieve these goals? And what information do we need to inform these decisions? So I'm using the example of Kaiser forest disease in India. From a systemic perspective, what would your comment be on this graph? As now sensitized to systems, what would you say about this graph?
Where does it start?
Starts with the tick cycle.
Almost linear.
It's linear.
Okay.
So we're talking about a linear approach. We think, okay, it all starts with the tick, so our cause is clear, and we have no feedback. But in fact, there's a lot of feedback. So if we want to understand this disease and address it, we're going to have to think about how this feeds back, and how our activity is going to affect the ticks, and the infection within the ticks, obviously. So for this particular disease, we'd have a multitude of goals that we could address. So we could think about reducing the exposure to ticks, the human exposure, or reducing the human exposure to the virus, which are two different things. We can also reduce the prevalence in ticks. We could reduce the prevalence in monkeys or the prevalence in humans. We could reduce the impact on humans. And all these would require very different decisions. So if we want to address human exposure to ticks, we need to know where the ticks are and therefore not go there. But if we want to reduce the impact on humans, we need to think about how to reduce the risk of infection on one hand, but also how to raise the capacity to cope. So those are, again, those require different information because we need to know the probability, the consequences of the infection, and the resilience to the infection. So that means that depending on the goal that we have with our system, we need to provide different information, and that will also require different type of surveillance. So limitations to this are that if we focus on surveillance on single species, we miss the complexity of the ecosystem out of which these diseases emerge. Again, I'm talking about emerging properties of a complex system. If the system is isolated in different parts, it will not behave as a behavior, but it will actually have a cause-effect in a linear way that we can easily model. So as a scientist, we like this dissociation of elements in order to be able to model and understand it, but it will not reflect the behavior that the system will have as a whole. So we have no information on changing states of the ecosystem, but we also have resource constraints. So ideally, obviously, we would like to model everything and know everything, but we can't because we don't have the resources. We have time constraints. We need to focus on mitigation usually, and we don't really have time to understand the structure of systems and to really focus on prevention and, for example, address land use change. So we have a poor information flow between sectors as another limitation. So this is a proposal that a colleague of mine, John Berzowski, and myself have put together, how we think that we should address complex system surveillance or One Health surveillance. So the first step would be to define the problem in a transdisciplinary method, including goals to achieve. So those people that are concerned by it should have a say in what the goal actually should be. Then we should create a model of the system of interest using participatory modeling, because people that are actually down on the ground and concerned by it, they're going to have a lot of tacit knowledge that you will find in no paper published. They'll tell you, I'm not going to do this because of this and this and this, and you will never know about it until after you have realized that your idea doesn't work. So then you need to identify the nodes and links that are important determinants of health within this system, so that the points of high leverage. And those are the ones that are going to provide, that are going to be the target for decision making. And that's where you need information. So those are going to be the target of your surveillance. And then you need to design the surveillance system, and as a consequence, start monitoring the system over time, and then verify whether you actually achieve those goals. And again, on the right-hand side, we have participation and transdisciplinarity along the way. So we think that this is really the important part, is that everybody contributes to every step of surveillance. And we've published a paper at the WHO trying to align the policy cycle with this concept of One Health surveillance. So the policy cycle are the the three purple boxes on the outer circle. So you have agenda setting, implementation, and evaluation. In the middle you have knowledge integration. So those are all the systems thinking, multi-criteria, decision analysis, and transdisciplinarity. And those will affect the agenda setting through agreeing on problems and goals, creating a model, and identifying the targets of surveillance. then the implementation is going to be about designing surveillance systems. And here we're talking about passive surveillance, active surveillance, and this is going to be blurred. The differences are not going to be so clear anymore. And then evaluation obviously comes along with the monitoring of the system and verifying the goals. So all this we're putting out there for discussion, because we think we need to start rethinking on how we do surveillance and what we actually are aiming for. Are we aiming for no disease, or are we aiming for health?
Unmuted.
So, discussion's open.
Thank you very much for an interesting and thought-provoking presentation. Do we have any, I didn't go through because we looked quickly to see that there was quite a large audience on the phone, so we didn't do a roll call, but please, are there any questions first on the line or points for discussion for Simon? Okay, we have one in the room here, so Raju.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. But I have... Okay.
Just while Raju is coming closer to the microphone, or we're dealing with microphone issues here, I'll mention that the CZ is recording this presentation. And it can be made available for anybody who might have missed it or would like to review it. And I was going to ask Simon if we can share the presentation maybe in a PDF.
Sure, I can share the slides.
With the networks. Yeah, so the presentation will be made available for participants or for anybody who missed it. Raju, I think you have a speaker now.
Thank you once again, very, very, very interesting presentation. And the topic itself. But my question is from at the beginning, the title itself, the name itself of One Health, I kind of find, I don't know if that term specifically addresses One Health, or does it target human health in terms of trying to incorporate information from other areas, other sources like animals, agriculture, whatever, and then trying to focus to prevent or control or address human health issues. It seems to me, when I think of when I was dealing with E. coli 015787, it's not a problem at all in cattle. It's not a problem with other animals which we tend to, get information from. So One Health essentially says it's a health problem for animals as well as for other creatures or as well as human, which is I find it very difficult to understand. Is it the term, or is it something? My understanding is different.
Well, I think you're addressing a very important issue, because there's a lot of different interpretations of One Health. So I don't think there's one single way to interpret One Health. What I'm talking about is the result of our network and the agreement we found among those 240 scientists that were there. And our understanding is that we need to shift our way of deciding, because, as you say, our conventional way of deciding is humans first. We think it's not about humans first, it's about we are part of a whole, and it's about us first as a whole. So we may have also to think about certain concessions that we have to make towards the benefit of other elements of our environment. And those are going to be tough calls to make. But I think there's no way around it if we see how things are changing in terms of climate change, in terms of biodiversity loss, etc., etc. There's a lot of indicators of health of the system within which we live that are deteriorating. And I think when we talk about One Health surveillance, this is what we need to look at. We are having serious concerns about the health of us within the system of which we are part. And E. coli might be one of the issues, but I don't think at the current state of things, I don't think E. coli is primordial issue.
No, so that's why, like, when we look at One Health as such, it should be like, if there is an E. coli problem in humans, so probably is it like, does it have the presence of E. coli in the food chain? Like, say, has never been assessed whether, like, does it increase the productivity of the produce that we eat? The presence of being, I don't think that's been looked at, and so that's why, like, if it's a One Health per se, like if we're looking at One Health, so benefits of the presence of E. coli in those sectors should also be evaluated.
Absolutely. So I completely concur with your idea that, you know, we should think about what does E. coli mean along the way within the system. It might have some beneficial effect somewhere.
But the One Health concept itself, like when we think of One Health, essentially it ends up being trying to address human health problems. Like we look at E. coli problems in different places, like farms, slaughterhouses, things everywhere, and try to link it to human health or human health events.
Well, I think we shouldn't forget that essentially we are humans. And the concept of health and the concept of deciding is a human issue. We cannot, nature doesn't decide, it selects, right? So the problem is actually ours. It's not a natural, nature doesn't have a problem. Besides, climate change is not a natural problem of nature either, because, you know, it just takes another couple of million years before we have some vertebrates again on Earth. But the point is that we need to start reflecting on how we want to decide and whether always deciding for us first is actually not detrimental for us. And I think that's really what it is about. We will not escape the fact that when we decide as humans, because we cannot decide for the dog.
Yeah, John, I have a question. And thank you. It's a very good presentation, Simon, and I really appreciate it because I think it makes a parallel to what we are actually trying to achieve within Canada on the integration of the surveillance that we are actually doing. But you presented the concept of One Health and the case studies that you made. You were talking about the last 4 years. Have you reached a point where you know, this is functioning as a One Health approach at a certain level with all the different entities that you are describing? I mean the sort of implementation as such with all the different components, I don't know if you understand my idea, the different components together at a certain range or level. Mm-hmm. And then once it's there, it works, there's functionality, all the different components with a certain range of countries, and the system, the structure is there, it functions, and it works, and we are making decision at a One Health level. Have you reached to a certain extent that point, or it's ongoing, it's building, it's developing, and I just want to figure out, you know, the concept is great, but I just want to figure out, you know, how at the end this is coming to an implementation phase and how big it can be, because actually we are talking about the whole world. We're talking about global.
Well, I think that's it's obviously the central question. I think in what we can look at is development, sustainable development, and a lot of projects in sustainable development, they're going along the transdisciplinarity process. So they try really to help, and that's usually at a relatively local level, to try to capture the problems and then address them in an integrated. Now, I think development per se is rather, let's say, economic, maybe a social focus. And I think in health we have a great potential going along that line as well, because I think in health we have social determinants of health, we have environmental determinants of health, and we have economic determinants of health, which would actually allow us to really support sustainable development from a different angle. Now, as we address it, I mean, what we've done in these 4 years was really trying first to look at evaluation. We didn't want to say this is what One Health is, but we actually thought we are trying to provide a framework in which we can capture what One Health could be. And we're not postulating that in these hexagrams you need to have a fully fledged, like, one point on each axis, because I would actually, I suspect that if you integrate too many, it's going to be inhibitory to make any progress. So we want to provide this framework so that we can get an idea on how far do we need to go. And to do that, we need to actually be able to capture how far you can go. But I would argue that probably somewhere in the 80% of each of the dimensions is probably the most effective then to actually reach something. Because if you, you can maintain a permanent, perpetuate a conversation without getting anywhere because you can't agree on goals. And that might be because you just include too many. So I think we're definitely, to answer your question, we're definitely not there. In the sense that we could not say this is the best way to go.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions on the telephone or in the room? We're about 20 people in the room here in Ottawa. Any?
Now, thank you, Simon, for that talk. Obviously, it's thought-provoking, and so certainly linear is simple, and then we assume we know A and we know A to B, A to C. And if you move into like a or very complex system, how do you deal with the unknowns? How do you plan for unknowns? I mean, in a complex system, we're not going to know everything yet, and will we ever? How do you plan for that in terms of a project with goals? I'm not sure. Because then if you evaluate something and you say, well, we failed because, but maybe there's an element of something completely unknown, and maybe that's why it didn't work. I guess much the same as you said, unless you talk to people on the ground, something's going to fail simply because you didn't know. So how do you account for that? How do you buffer the system so that it is robust or resilient against that?
Okay, so I think there's two elements. We've got the unknown, there's the known unknown and the unknown unknown that has been coined. So the known unknown is basically the uncertainty in the parameters that we have. So we can cater for that by putting probability distributions and stuff like that. But then we have the unknown unknown, which we have no parameter, we have no idea, we don't even know the quality of it. And to give you an example, there was a HIV prevention campaign by the Public Health Office in Switzerland in jails. So they said, okay, we're going to distribute lubricant and condoms, and we're going to put a machine there so people can get it, and then problems should be solved. And they put it there, and they had sales. They were rising, exponential rise of sales. So they thought, well, everything worked. Theory of change was people would buy them, would use them, and problem solved. So then they sent a social scientist, and she went in there and asked, so what do you do with these condoms? So it turned out that they were using the condoms for balloons for birthday parties, and the lube was used for hair gel. So, mission accomplished. The point is that those are qualities that you can't model this with a quantitative approach. So you need feedback. You need to have this sensor that captures what you what you don't know. And that's why we're saying that you need the nonlinear impact evaluation. You need to have somebody out there that captures what's going on. You just need people on the field, and the important thing is that those people need not to be afraid to say that it doesn't work. If you have a top-down authoritarian approach, people are not going to tell you that it doesn't work. They're just going to do, okay, you told me to sell these condoms, I'm going to sell them, even though they know it doesn't work. And that's why you need to have a learning organization. That's why you need to have the trust. You're building trust because everybody can fail, and that is an important realization. That's why you need adaptive leadership. You need shared leadership so that everybody can actually represent his stake and her stake, and therefore then also give you the feedback. And then it is a matter of evaluation. I mean, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. And that's really where I think we need to change thinking, because we would say if we modeled something and it didn't work the way we thought, we were wrong. But okay, but so what? You know, I mean, we can correct, and that's the important part. It's that behavior is a matter of feedback and appropriate response to this feedback. And that is something that within our model of operation we haven't integrated yet. We're still thinking, you know, that if the modeler does a good job, we'll be successful. But that's not anymore, in One Health, that's not really the idea. It's really, well, we'll give it a shot and let's see what happens. And then we give it a second shot and see what happens. And then we do the third one. And we just keep doing it until we're happy. So, I don't know whether I addressed your...
I think you did. Thank you.
20.
Thank you very much for a very nice...
Can you please come where Raju found a microphone?
Sure. Even though we say it's One Health, but as we have seen in your presentation and some of the experience we have in the CFIA, there is when we talk One Health means like, you know, there's a lot of dimensions to it. Right, you know, like just even you look in CFIA, we have animal health, we have plant health, we have food safety, and these are just few things, and you were talking even beyond that, like at ecosystem level, right? And some of our experience in the past that when we were trying to, you know, have some decisions, because you can talk, but someday you will have to take some decisions, right? In order to take those decisions, you'll need a very transparent process where you want to do some measurements and, you know, like some parameters, some indicators. So what was your experience with them where you have, like, you know, human health along with the plant health or animal health, you know, where they're all looking from their different prism, right, you know? And here you're trying to basically find the center of those prisms, right? Just want to see what was your experience and.
Well, let's. I guess here most people are concerned with animal health. So,
yes.
What are your indicators for animal health?
We may have some people from Public Health Agency on the phone or as well.
Okay. So, but let's say what are your indicators of animal health, not disease?
I don't know if we think like that. That's the problem. You know, you know, it sort of gets back to what are we aiming for? You mentioned that before, and then you have the political sort of dimension that layers on a bunch of complexities. And everyone wants to play the advantage game. What's in it for me? How can I seek advantage over another country, another region, or whatever? So we're never really thinking in that way.
Exactly. So that's my experience. We don't think health. We think disease. And that's the problem, because disease is where your animal has lost its resilience. Disease and Melissa mentioned it in the beginning that I'm interested in early warnings of critical transitions. Now, disease is a critical transition. That is too late. If disease has happened, your animal can't cope with it. And it might have had E. coli before, but it didn't get sick, so you didn't see it. So the point is that we need to start thinking on how do we know that the animal is still resilient. And we need to start thinking about indicators for resilience and not thinking about indicators for past critical transition, because that means that we respond, but we want to anticipate. And what you mentioned is very, very important, is that at the moment we have a culture of excelling, a culture of champions. And this culture of champions is detrimental to collaboration. And I mean, I think we've got an accentuated form of this within academia, where we only select those that have the strongest elbows, and that can convince more people about their own importance. But we don't really underpin or foster people that are actually harmonizing the community. I mean, if you go into a leadership workshop, the first thing you'll hear is that you need diversity. Well, at university, difficult. The diversity of mindsets is very, very narrow.
Before, and I totally agree with you. And before you are talking, and the ideal end of this One Health concept is prevention, anticipate. And the world that we are living now, because to change the culture of the whole world, and the mentality of human beings of saying, we need them all, and we're going to get to the point where you can achieve having that level of diversity that the farmers say is going to be as important as the highest level global summity on some kind of disease. It's going to be many, many, many years. So the concept of One Health, I think, it needs to be applicable in the world that we're living in now, so we can actually amend or tweak it to the point that we can work on going toward a prevention goal. I don't know if you understand what I mean. You need to apply it, and it works in a response mode, and then we can be able to apply it in a preventional mode.
Well, I agree with you, but I think we need to have a goal in mind.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And what we're projecting here is kind of a goal in mind. And I don't know who of you have been to the Canadian History Museum and know the story of this sculpture, because it says a trip in the boat together. And it's about the grandfather of the artist, who's a First Nations person, and he took a wolf in his canoe to cross a river. So that approach, I mean, it takes a lot of courage to put the wolf into your boat. And that's probably what you're asking. We need to put the wolf in our boat and go to WHO and tell them to do the same. And I think that's really what we talk about. I think it can happen because we're all people that decide. And we're all people, and we all have a connection through the rest of life. But we have installed so many rules and unwritten rules and procedures that inhibit us from being human. And then we forget, because we're so concerned about all the regulations within which we operate, that we forget what we actually aimed for in the very beginning. And that's why I emphasize on this idea where we want to go, because that's who we are and what we should be doing. And I think it's even possible at the WHO level if the people that sit at the table realize that they're not, they're not it. They're not it, but they're part of it.
I just thought, just to add to that, if we want to incorporate everything like ecosystem plus animal and human health together, wouldn't it be a good idea to produce, have a career stream that treats animals as well as humans like basic level that way you integrate it, like can integrate data easily from those sources and then specialize into humans or specific animal treatment. And then maybe like basic level would be treating animals as well as humans as well as the plants. And then that kind of career
I think that will be the consequence of thinking differently. I don't think you can start with it because you need to first.
Yeah.
But I totally agree with you. And on the other hand,
because they are very similar. Like if it's treatment for infectious diseases, you give antibiotics like bacteria, so antibiotics to humans as well as to animals, which is very common. Like, and then these are like common treatment elements. So only for specialized kind of in diseases would you need specialized manpower. Otherwise, if it's common infections, kind of like treatment is kind of similar. Even in plants, maybe if it's a bacterial disease, they're going to treat with some kind of antibiotic property, like chemicals that can, you know.
Well, I think you're. I agree with you, but I think I have to take your colleague's perspective that we need to do something that's practical right now. Right?
Okay.
And right now we have segregated curricula with highly specialized specialists that are on top of the food chain. So what I think, what I as a scientist can contribute is trying to break down my need and desire for appreciation. I need to become humble, and I need to start being part of whole and not being the expert. And I think it starts with every one of us, because we have a tendency, we all, I mean, at least I have a tendency to be patronizing at times, because I think I've learned it and I've done it and so on, and somebody comes along and tells me, well, that, you know, I don't perceive it that way. And I mean, we've got now the fake news, right? That's the biggest challenge for science. So what we do is that we step on our high horses and we say, okay, every fake news is rubbish because we know it. And that's the beginning. Because that's where we start cutting ourselves off the rest. And we need to start finding a way to deal with this by saying, okay, let's sit together and talk about this. And let's, okay, you think it that way, although I believe it different, but this is a question of belief. And then we're back into religion. So we need to start agreeing on what is evidence and what isn't. And there's a big movement at the moment about evidence. The flat earthers, they are, I mean, they're a very interesting phenomenon because they only believe what they see, and they don't believe what scientists say. So to a certain extent, they're highly empirical, so very scientific, but they reject scientists, or science as a community. So I think we need to start finding ways to communicate and to interact and to actually align these perspectives.
I was feeling that this starts with communication.
Absolutely.
It starts with, and to be able to communicate together at different levels and how to be humble at that level, you need to build trust. And that takes time. We are actually experiencing within Canada that aspect, because for many years, you know, we have in the scientific community people at different levels, which is federal, provincial, academia, private sector, trying to gather these people together and develop an integrating surveillance system at the pan-Canadian level. And it's not easy, because just to build the trust and organize these communities, it takes years, and people change within the community. So whenever you have a new element, you have a different integration, and then the culture of sharing the data. So if you can get to the point that trust is high, then you can try to share the data, and then you can take a look at what's really happening, and then you can integrate more and more and more. But it takes time. It's a lot of work on the communications aspect, a lot of work on the trust development aspect. Because we are always on things to be done, mostly early.
But I think it's important when you say we need to acknowledge that it needs time and resources. Because for trust, we need meetings, we need eye-to-eye contact, we need personal contact, we need the experience that we can trust. And I think that's really something that in our whole endeavor for efficiency, we tend to forget. We tend to think, oh, you can do that easier. I mean, I have a lot of colleagues that will say, yeah, can't we do that by email? So I tend to insist that we need to have it together. Because I think that's really where we start. That's where we start building trust, and then we can, from there, we can go on.
I think it really dependent on a receptive audience as well. And when there's a lot of self-interest at play and a lot of tribal sort of attitude, whether it's, you know, at an individual or collective level, at a tribal level, that's really problematic. And people have preformed beliefs that may not be rational. You can't engage in a rational discourse with someone to try and change their mindset if they have a preformed belief and they haven't reasoned themselves or rationalized themselves into that position in the first place. It's a belief, an internal belief. If that's reinforced by the tribe, that's highly problematic and you don't have a receptive audience.
I agree, and I think that's why your key word was a rational discourse, because it's not a rational discourse. It's an emotional discourse.
Exactly.
And we need to understand that people decide with their hearts and not with their brains. Yep. And if we want to make a change in the right direction, we need to address their hearts and not their brains. So the rational background for us as a scientist should be our base where we start. But then our communication needs to become human. And we should never forget that we're not robots.
But that comes, sorry,
where also you can start engaging with people that they will find all sorts of so-called rational arguments to counter your argument, because you're not communicating at the level where actually the issue is, I think.
On me?
How practical is that? That need to do that, and it's ideal, it's beautiful, even thinking about it. We want that, and everybody wants that, but how practical is that during the course of history of human beings? And now, current just Canada and U.S. relationship, very simple example of that.
Well, I think you have, there's techniques. There's a technique that's called nonviolent communication. Yeah. It's a very useful tool set, just to start. It's not perfect, it's a good start, because we tend to respond with our thoughts. And sometimes it's just enough to think about what is actually at stake. I mean, you're mentioning the American-Canadian relationship. Well, you're having a partner that has got a serious emotional issue, and that's appreciation. So, if you want to be diplomatic about this person, you're going to have to pat him along the fur until that need is satisfied. Then you can start talking.
You're never going to satisfy a need with pathological narcissism.
Well, you need to believe at least that it could be. Somebody on the line that wanted to...
Yeah, somebody on the phone tried to speak up. Please.
Yeah, Melissa, it's Andrea here.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi there. I just wanted to say that where it comes to this, I think we have to lead by example. And I think one of the ways that we start to have that discussion is to drop our own fears of, you know what, we have to start sharing openly and we have to start doing it. And I think I've seen within the CZ community in the couple of years I've been doing this that does start to happen. It does, Joanne, you're right. It takes a long time to build that trust, but we have to start going there, and it actually comes down to each of us being comfortable in our own skin, comfortable to say something that maybe ends up being wrong, but it's great to be able to brainstorm. And I do think that this community, you know, we have started doing that and have started dropping, at least I have, and I see it in my colleagues as well. Just drop it and start leading by example, and ultimately that will lead to culture shift. And I'm really grateful to Simon for this discussion and also for bringing up nonviolent communication. because you can change the direction of those conversations if you understand where that emotional tribal need is coming from. And
hello? Oh, Andrea, we've lost you. Sorry.
Mid-thought, Ash or Debbie, and then Ashwani.
I think when you were talking about being humble, you're talking about egos, right? That we need to sort of be aware of our egos and how they might be actually preventing us from being the best we can. And does that come back to, are you talking about people's self-esteem, like that maybe the ones that seem to have the biggest egos, actually they have low self-esteem? Like, are we really getting into the social sciences here with the core of what we need to address? Are we collectively raising people with basically low self-esteem, and is that where we should be starting? Is that going to address the tribalism, and with tribalism comes like a lack of trust, and like, are we going to, do we have to go back that far, or can we somehow kind of jump into the middle and fix the problem in the middle?
I wouldn't dare giving you an answer there. I think, I mean, you've really touched the core of the question, I think, because one of the many questions, but we are, I've got a son that's 7, and he's in his first year at school, and he already gets these assessments on to achieve levels. Right? So he's not assessed on the progress that he's done, but he's assessed on the absolute achievement that he has done. And I think that's really where we need to start thinking, is that we need to acknowledge that everybody has its own capacities, everybody has its own possibilities, and a context which allow fostering the don't, and then we need to start acknowledging that and giving everybody a space in society. And I think that's really, if that addresses somehow what you're asking. I mean, we have a big problem in Switzerland as well, that we're valuing people based on their final achievement. So what is your highest degree that you do? That's basically the criteria of good or bad. And I think that's really not what the issue is about. It's about, you know, have you done the most out of your potential from your own power? Yes or no? And that should be really where we value people for. And that would ultimately also probably lead to them feeling more comfortable and feeling less threatened by your judgment, because you actually don't really judge them on what they've done and not on where they stand.
And touching a very, I would say, sensitive area of the human nature in the way that we are evaluating at the bottom, because then we would have to change in the whole world, not only in Canada or Switzerland, the way we evaluate kids at school. So our scholar, you know, way of evaluating is based, you know, on marks and based on levels and whatever you want to call it. So just for your own information, yesterday I will tell you just so something happened to me yesterday, because I was reading the newspaper, and in the newspaper there was this article about this lady in UK that she received a letter where it was written, a journalist in Montreal had written a letter to her and started the letter with Mrs. something, you know, whatever her name. Now, she was a PhD. She wanted to be addressed as a doctor. So she made a big fuss about that. And in English and in French, according to the linguistic norms, it is different, because when you call somebody doctor in French, it means somebody from the 3 kind of medicine, whatever it's veterinary, human, or dental. Otherwise, it's a Mr. and Mrs. In English, it's totally different. And I surprised myself by answering to to the guy who wrote the article that I still nowadays, 2018, why is it so important? To me, it was a futile aspect because it is not because of the title that you have. The values are based on your competence. And the competence, the title doesn't mean anything. But the competence and the value of the individual is mainly important. So I wrote back to that journalist and I said, well, this is not me, but I am going to put my great salt here. And I started the answer on saying, well, you know, I've been a vet for 36 years, and I was told by some of my classmates, you know, what, how come you don't have yourself called doctor? I said, I don't care about the doctor. It means to me, if you're a good or lesser good or bad, that is going to make the difference. So it's a lifetime issue to come back and change the scholar way of evaluating the kids and the human beings and the mentality and the culture of researchers, because they have a different way, and, you know, human ego. And to me, it's funny because we are talking and we are relating to tribal as something very bad, something very basic that is not evoluted. Well, maybe the way they do something sometimes in these tribus could be very much interesting and could be at times, so it's pejorative using a word like that, because maybe in some tribus we can learn things. Of course, we may not want to go there on certain other aspects, but on the way of doing things, sometimes it could be a good thing to integrate into that One Health.
Thank you for bringing it back to One Health. You know, I was jotting down notes here in case I had to animate the discussion, but clearly, yeah, it's not necessary because we're past 1:30. So I don't know if anybody's still on the phone, but thanks to people who joined on the phone and to everybody who came in the room. Simon's email address is just there, a bit hidden by Annie's bottle. And we will share the presentation, and I'm sure he would be happy to continue the discussion.